It has arrived. A while back, I released a character sheet PDF to help my viewers build awesome fake people. And now I have a bigger, better, smarter version 2.0. I even hired a graphic designer to make it look not terrible. This whole thing started because someone reminded me of how cringe online character sheets are. They usually ask for a whole bunch of details, but they fail to connect those details to a character's underlying drives. So as a result of this, the character is represented as a pile of scattered trivia with no through line and no indication of how to actually use them in a story. So my sheet focuses on causality. See these arrows here? See the causality? Yeah, there's room for traits and quirks, but the more important thing is understanding where those traits and quirks come from so you can construct a deep, compelling story around this character. Now, of course, I'm not claiming to have distilled the human essence into a flowchart. This is a tool. It's meant to help you solve problems and identify blind spots. There's always this subsection of people that get really mad when you try to categorize and explain human motivations because people are too complicated. You can't just describe them with models. You're oversimplifying. And it's like, okay, so what do you want me to do? Just bask in the vibes? The only reason I have a career is because people started getting sick of that approach. As far as I'm concerned, partially helpful tools are better than no tools. So I'm going to break down this tool section by section, and I'm going to start at the start. Remember, it's linear, it has causality. Things cause other things. I originally called this first box trauma, but I should have known that would cause issues. People seem to disagree on what the T word means. I think arguing about the meaning of a word is childish because the whole point of words is to agree on what they mean so we can use them to argue about the things that actually matter. So if a word makes things confusing, that just tells me I should use a different word. Hence, trauma has been replaced with negative experience. Not quite as punchy, but the TikTok connotation was just weighing too heavily on people. This can mean anything from acute violent incidents to patterns of dysfunction in the home or culture, to not being valued unless you achieve something, to not being valued at all, to being forced into a caretaker role, to suffering because of a disability. All of it. Step one is bad thing. But Lucas, does a person's psychology have to be grounded in bad thing? Yes it does. For you, for me, for your characters, for everyone. You were born confused and screaming. The starting line was fear, 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 survive. How do I get my needs met? And then you had to figure out what worked. And the survival mechanisms you discovered became your unconscious drives, which continue to affect all areas of your life. Happy chemicals are just your body's way of saying, this is working, I'm getting my needs met, keep doing this, at least in principle. I could spend hours explaining why I believe this, but that's not the point of the video. My house, my rules. A positive experience cannot go here. That's not how it works. Now, what can go here is nothing. You don't have to dig this deep with your character if you don't want to. This here, which we'll get to in a second, is the core. But this is just how the core got made. Core lore, backstory. You can tell a functional story without addressing it. As long as you understand here forward, you're good. I only added this because I think the phrasing, to prevent this from affecting me again, I must, is a really helpful way to conceptualize coping mechanisms. Without it, you'll get people writing stuff like love as the core belief, or some other fragmented thought that falls apart under scrutiny. At the very least, I'd recommend you put some general backstory in this box. Like, just for you, even if it never makes it on the page. Something as simple as shunned by the people close to me, and then this will happen again unless I don't get close to people. And then that affects everything else. It's really that simple. It doesn't necessarily have to be backstory either. It could be something that happens in the story. All that matters is bad thing, coping mechanism. Train your brain to conceptualize people like this. The next box I've called many things. The soul, the circle, the deepest point. Everything after it is a manifestation of it, and everything before is backstory. It's the point at which the world becomes you. It's the core. Again, the phrasing is super crucial because a core belief is a response to external forces. Got punished for stepping out of line? Follow the rules. Got betrayed by someone? Can't trust the people around you, or you'll be betrayed again. Remember, this is specific, but this is general. The bad thing happened in a limited capacity, but it was so scary that you took what you learned and applied it to everything. That's how you get the important parts of your personality. Fear doesn't get its own box because fear is just an emotion. Fear is more like the grease that keeps this machine running. You fear this happening again, so you think and act in a certain way to escape it, but you overcorrect and it ruins your life. This is a generalization. That's the whole point. You can't mention other characters in this block. You can't mention specific events or locations. The lesson is general because the character is going to take that lesson they learned and apply it to all of these other things that it doesn't necessarily need to apply to. It's going to trickle down and pollute everything. But there's a step that kind of happens before that. Most people, not all people, but most people aren't aware of the fact that their core beliefs are coping mechanisms. Let's say you have a super nihilistic doomer character. This character tried to hope and was punished for it, so they've acclimated to hopelessness. But if you ask them about themselves, would they tell you, oh, I'm like this because my experiences conditioned me to feel this way? Probably not, because that's still subconscious. Instead, their brain slots this in so they don't have to accept that they're afraid. In Hopeless Guy's case, this box would be some long-winded explanation of why life is meaningless. So when people ask him, hey, why do you not try in your relationships? He can defer to this instead of confronting the truth. This is the subconscious stuff. This is the conscious stuff, usually. So he doesn't have access to the answers here. He just has access to this lie. People call this the lie the character believes. Don't overthink it. Usually the lie is as simple as X equals good or Y equals bad. Why are you obsessed with your career? Oh, because success is inherently good. Why do you worry about keeping your apartment spotless? Because impurity is bad. Why do you constantly compliment people? Because I'm such a nice person. This is basically the ego. It can take on a moralistic dimension. It's quite literally whatever helps the character sleep at night. It's the lie they tell themselves so that they can keep functioning without having to acknowledge the real root cause of the behavior. Does this stage absolutely have to be here? No. I know people who are fully aware of why they are the way they are, and it doesn't necessarily make them any healthier or unhealthier. Like one time I met a girl who had been diagnosed with BPD, and she basically told me her whole terrifying childhood story for why she couldn't trust anyone. And I was like, yep, that checks out. That makes sense. I can see how those events could mold you into the person I'm talking to now. But I like to use the lie because it just gives me more story. It gives me more walls to knock down, an opportunity for a more complex arc. The end of Act 1 could maybe be like, oh, maybe this isn't true. And then Act 2 is them realizing what's really driving them. And then in Act 3, they're finally able to come to terms with their backstory and de-universalize their core belief. Whereas if they already have a direct line to this, you're gonna have a harder time creating gradual character growth. I don't want you to think this leads to this, leads to this. The core belief is driving all of these things. It's directly piloting them. The lie only exists as a rational coat of paint. It's a way to word the core belief that doesn't implicate the self in the crime of generalization, but it's not its own domino, not really. And exposing the phoniness of this lie is usually the first step to uncovering this. The lie is typically a statement that's easy to prove wrong, like a character who learned they were not valuable unless they succeeded might create the lie, money and success are the meaning of life. But when they get money and success, they don't feel fulfilled. This dissolves, and the real emotional issue underneath is laid bare. So yeah, once it passes through the squeaky clean ego filter, the core belief starts quietly infecting all these other areas of life. The way a person presents themselves, the way they treat themselves, the way they interact with others, the way they speak, the goals they set. These boxes aren't definitive categories, they kind of bleed into each other. But again, when you're creating theory, you gotta find the right balance of reductionism and practicality. Which brings me to the single biggest reason I made this thing. I have always wanted to knock the want off its pedestal. Everybody worships the want. People treat it like it's the heart of a character, constantly. Screenwriting books, story gurus. The character has to have a strong goal. You have to make them obsessed with getting something, and then you have to create obstacles, and and I hate this. I despise it. It's so incredibly limiting in terms of the types of characters you can create. It puts guardrails up where you don't need them. Like, I'm only allowed to write hyper-ambitious characters with a definitive sense of purpose in life. That's insane. And I'm a very driven person. I direct all of my energy towards the things that I want. But the things I want still change. Like 2 years ago, I wanted to make documentaries. 12 years ago, I wanted to be an inventor. One time during COVID, I went on a 5-hour odyssey to find a Waffle House that wasn't closed. Goals aren't your soul, Aaron. You're telling me that for those 5 hours, Waffle House was the deepest layer of my being? Get out of here. I think what the want worshippers are trying to say is that a clear want is a good way to drive the plot, which it is. But that does not mean it's the center of a fictional person, no more than your current want is the center of you. The only reason you want things is because you believe They're valuable. It's an extension of something deeper. It's not I want this and I believe this. It's I want this because I believe this. Again, causality, arrow. If you can take a goals plotline and link it to a love interest plotline by grounding both in the same issue, your whole character will be much more cohesive. Or a love plotline and a lifestyle plotline, or all of them. Look, the very obvious revelation here is that your character does not have to have a clear goal. In fact, they can put as much or as little stock as they see fit into any of these categories. If there's no logical reason for them to care about their appearance, then this box would just say, doesn't matter, or whatever's comfortable, or whatever's functional. People have different priorities. Again, these boxes are not just to write down how the character talks or how they feel about relationships in a vacuum. If all you know about your character is this stuff, then you're probably not ready to fill out the sheet yet. I mean, you're welcome to try and use it as a deductive tool, but it's not just a place to house the character's information. It's a tool to establish a line of causality. I cannot stress this enough. These boxes are here so that you can ask, how would a person with this brain talk? How would a person with this brain feel about relationships? I picked these categories because I think they're the areas most closely tied to core beliefs, but some traits are less closely tied to this, but still part of a person. Everyone, please welcome bonus page 1. If you look at it like a trickle down type thing, the boxes at the top are more connected to the core from the first page, but then as you get lower, the traits get more disparate and less important. You can start throwing in random stuff once you get to the second page. Like your hobbies are probably somewhat a reflection of the core belief, but some people just like crocheting. Your temperament I can probably get a good picture of if I know this stuff, but if you told me that Doomer Guy was slow to anger, I wouldn't be like, that's a contradiction. I'd be like, oh, cool. A little lower, like addictions can be linked to insecurities. Someone who feels the need to take party drugs all the time might be doing it because they developed a thrill-seeking dopamine complex to get away from bad thing, but like maybe not. The further down it goes, the more out of my lane I become. Like, I don't really know much about how addictions work. Skills, they could correlate to coping mechanisms, like creativity could be a result of having to escape into your imagination. I see that one a lot because I work on the internet, but like maybe not. I'm pretty creative, but I don't come from that background. If a character is just creative or just smart or just good at cornhole, I won't get my trunks in a bunch trying to tie it back to their inner demons. You go lower down on the causality ladder until you reach the trivial likes and dislikes, which have very little, if anything, to do with the big stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, it's fun if you can make these a microcosm of this, but I'm not gonna try to pretend that my love of Grader's Black Raspberry Chip or the Canadian alternative rock band Metric have anything to do with my core motivations as a person. On this bonus page, I also added weaknesses, basically just an opportunity for you to reflect on how your character might be vulnerable to manipulation. And then I put a place for artwork because I know a lot of people are into that. You can drop a PNG on there or scribble it in crayon, whatever you want. This is just a blank space, baby, and I'll write your name. These two could be the front and back of one document, but I like to keep them separate and stack them thusly because of the other bonus pages. Bonus page 2 is the ARCs DLC. You take the core belief, first you ask, in the character's day-to-day life, who or what is reinforcing this? It's hard to believe something if you don't have reinforcers telling you that you're right. It could be a social media algorithm that just confirms your fears over and over again. It could be a hostile environment. It could be a situation like this. It could be literally this, like the bad can be ongoing. It can be the same bad that formed their personality all those years ago. What matters is you give them some reason to justify hanging on to their belief. Again, remember the lie coming up to give this a nice rational coat of paint. If a character has been in a bad situation for a while, they've probably transcended the initial emotions and built up a rational suit of armor. And then later in the story, some people or events come along and challenge the core belief. The loner forms a connection with someone who defies what his idea of people are. The skeptic encounters something that she can't find a reason not to believe in. The helper encounters a situation that they can't fix. And then in the end, do they hold on to their old insecurity, or do they let it go, or do they dive deeper into it and cause a whole lot more trouble? And how does that choice factor into the story? And how does it affect all of these things, all of these belief manifestations? So you can kind of do a before after and see how all the different areas of their life have changed because of their arc. This is just the absolute bare bones to get you started. This is not like a story structure guide. This is sort of the lowest common denominator for what an arc has to be. But this is really just about characters. This is not like a plot building thing. Finally, bonus page 3 over here, they're all kind of, see how it's like you lay them out. Remember themes. If you'll recall, one of the main pillars of my methodology thus far has been the perspectives on a theme model, where each character is meant to hold a different opinion on the quote-unquote theme of the story. But these days I don't talk about themes very often, and here's why. Whether you found it helpful or not, and I know a lot of people did, my themes dogma was all over the place. Sometimes I would say a theme was a question and that the different characters should have different answers to that question. Sometimes I would say the theme was the subject matter and that the characters should have different opinions on the subject matter. Sometimes I would just interpret it as exploring different roles in a conflict. And I got away with this because nobody else knows what a theme is either. It's one of those words that doesn't have a clear meaning, so you can kind of just use it however you want. Like for a lot of people, theme means the moral message you impose on your audience. I have never once used it like that, so if you ever heard me say theme and thought I was using the John Truby definition, oops, communication error. Some people use theme as like, oh, that's a recurring theme in the story. So then a theme is like a pattern. It's just kind of a gross, mucky word to me at this point. And I've been phasing it out of my vocabulary in the last several videos because I don't like how unclear it is. And honestly, I don't think we need it. If you want to talk about the emotional logic of your story that allows the good guy to win the gunfight, just say that. If you want to talk about your message to the audience, just say that. If you want to talk about the ideas that the characters grapple with, just say that. We don't need this fake deep catch-all word to tell the stories you want to tell. I've read 110-page drafts where I'll get to the end of it and I'll have oodles of notes, and not once did my brain go, something's missing. Oh, I know, the theme. I think we'd be better off just letting the consumers have that word. It's not an actual building block in the way I used to think it was. That being said, no matter what you call it, I think differentiating your characters based on their perspectives is the single most useful story tactic in the book. My go-to question in consulting is, what's the difference between these two? Because differences set the stage for conflict, and conflict is story. You want your characters to not just have different attitudes and opinions, but different souls. And so I made this bonus sheet to go right here. It's basically a way of tracking how other characters found different ways to cope with this. The same event or same culture or same pattern, but they found a different survival mechanism that went on to inform their personality. So it's like, I came from an abusive home too, but instead of retreating into my mind, I distracted myself with pleasure. Except that's all subconscious. So their surface dynamic would just be the introverted intellectual type versus the flaky adrenaline junkie type. And then they realize that deep down they have the same core wound. Maybe. Like, this is not essential. Characters can have fundamentally different backgrounds too. Maybe that's the point. You can have two clusters of characters, one who experienced something akin to this, and then one who share a different foundational experience. There's no rules here. This sheet is just for if you wanted to explore the different ways one could cope with a certain reality. I did my best, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. Regardless, you should probably give each character a full sheet and then compare this between characters and compare, this between characters and compare this between characters and see where they contradict each other. Figure out what would make these characters fight. Figure out what they have in common and why. That's everything, but I do want to spend some time talking about the stuff this sheet isn't. Obviously, this doesn't account for bodily motivations like survival. Sure, this stuff can color someone's thoughts on survival and the choices they take to survive, but the need to survive itself is kind of a separate thing. The other big one I always get is, can't a character have multiple core beliefs concurrently? And I've talked about this multiple times, so I won't get too deep into it, but principally, no. If you had to make them choose, one would supersede the other, and that's your answer. That's this. You just figured out what your character's core is. Like, yes, all human urges exist within us, but typically a story is about funneling it all down to see what really matters to a person. And a story is limited to what it's about. So this is not as constricting as it may seem. I know a lot of people feel like, oh, I only get one belief? I don't know, that sounds so limiting. But the singular soul is not meant to limit the humanity of your character. It's meant to give you a guiding light to explore a certain aspect of your character's humanity with precision and purpose. You can have all of the complexity, all of this expression, all of this humanity, and it all boils down to one point. If you were dead set on having a character with multiple unrelated core beliefs, Again, I don't think you need this. I think this is antithetical to what a story is, but hypothetically, you could do it by just using multiple sheets. Like if you wanted to make relationships and attachment its own thing and not tie it into the main core belief, you could do a second map for the same character to explore where that aspect of them comes from, or you could use multiple pen colors, but again, I think that's excessive. You've got all you need right here. I've also gotten questions about a character being one way and then experiencing bad thing and then becoming different and then experiencing another bad thing that's different and changing again and then repeating that over and over and over. And again, my response is kind of just why. A character ranges between the healthiest version of themselves and the unhealthiest version of themselves. Like they change along the same belief axis. That's all covered by this. But if they go through a metamorphosis that completely changes who they are on every level, in principle, I feel like that's not the same character anymore. It's apples and oranges. Now they're the unhealthiest version of someone else. I'm not a fan of that. Like if a character is a people pleaser and then they get sent to war, let's see how the war challenges their people-pleasing belief. I don't need to lay another foundation and start from scratch. And how would that even line up against the original conception of the character? It's just way off the rails. A character is a range of possibilities, but it's not an infinite range. To expand on the healthiest, unhealthiest self thing, I've been trying to figure out if this is a moral system or not. On one hand, there's no indication of what the right or wrong coping mechanism is. Like the kid who bullied you in 5th grade, your evil ex, your d-hole boss, they all had their own issues. They all had this. As far as my map is concerned, greed is no more of a coping mechanism than helping everybody you can all the time. The same process is responsible for creating every sort of compulsion, regardless of how destructive certain compulsions end up being. The ethical implications are kind of an afterthought. There is not a different version of this map for your mass murdering villain character. They're all just people. But at the same time, this model does assume an ideal state of being. The ideal state of being is a person without this. And I'm just presupposing that underneath the coping mechanism, before the trauma, every person is a pure soul that cares for themselves and the people around them. Bad people aren't evil, they're just damaged. And the default state is good. We come into the world good, and then bad thing, bad culture, bad whatever happens, and we find a way to get our needs met. So it is impossible to write an innately evil character with this logic. I'm not too sure on the science behind psychopathy, but if a person at their deepest level is driven to harm others and they were just born like that, I don't think that can be reconciled with this. That's a character you really cannot write using my system, whether they exist IRL or not. Finally, there's also the question of what if the person is right about their coping mechanism being appropriate? It helped the first time, who's to say they haven't been using it to actively manage a bad situation ever since? Again, I want to stress that this isn't bad because it's right or wrong or true or untrue. It's bad because the character has universalized it. They've applied it to every situation. Unless the character is completely 100% right that this coping mechanism is applicable 100% of the time, then there is an arc to be had. It might just look like letting their guard down for one person, but that's still a blow against this. That's positive change. And if the character is 100% right about their coping mechanism, then that's just a survival story. The point is nuance. The point is not all of me has to be owned by this. I am a person underneath my scars, and everything my scars led to. There is a pure light at the heart of everyone that we never see because nobody heals completely, but if we were all healed completely, we'd all be the same pure light. And growth is about moving closer to that light by getting rid of this. I don't know what that would be in philosophical terms because I don't read, and I also don't think it's literally true. Like nature and nurture are both factors in a person, right? But that's the idea which is underpinning all of this. Just thought you should know. Anyways, that's it, that's all. Sorry if you were expecting a bunch of pop culture examples. I didn't do those because I hate pop culture, and also because bringing up any IP would immediately alienate a large chunk of the audience, and I wanted this to be a more universal type video. So that's maybe more of a follow-up live stream, second channel discussion. I don't know. The sheet is available on my website, lsnarrativeconsulting.com, in the resources tab. The boxes are fillable, the pages are separate, so you can kind of build your own. Go check that out. It's free to use for personal, professional, or educational purposes. The graphic designer who helped me bring this thing to life is named Johnny Peterson. I linked him down below. He's the real deal. Thank you Turner Burton and Brandon McNulty and Schnee and Golitis and Elijah for your notes on my earlier drafts. Thank you Evan for helping me with the PDFs. As always, thank you to all of my patrons. You guys are the reason I'm able to do this stuff, and long live writerdom.